British comedian and actor and writer Stephen Fry has been featured in a YouTube video which has gone viral. As I speak these words, I think it's got about 6 million views. He was interviewed on an Irish program, and the interviewer asked him, because Fry is a notorious atheist. He's like Hitchens and Dawkins. He's a kind of ferocious atheist. The interviewer asked him, now suppose you're wrong about your atheism and you die and you get to the pearly gates and you meet God. What would you say to him? And Fry's response, that's why the thing has gone viral, is, I would say, what about bone cancer in children? Explain that to me. What about all of the horrific and undeserved suffering in the world? The interviewer says to him, well, you probably wouldn't get in if you say that. And he said, I wouldn't want to get into heaven. I would never want to spend eternity with such a cruel, capricious, malicious, and stupid God. Now, the rant goes on for about 5 minutes. I'm giving you just a little hint, but you probably get the drift. Look at a lot of the reaction to it. A lot of people saying, this is great, and finally, someone making this argument, and boy, is that a knockdown argument against religion. Well, here's the thing. I mean, we have heard the argument before. Almost every major theologian in our tradition, from St. Paul and St. Augustine all the way to C.S. Lewis, has wrestled with this problem of suffering.
I don't see how that helps your case if it's been around this long and it's still not solved, or at least it's still something that theologians are wrestling with, and you've been trying to solve it for 2,000 years. I don't see how that's a good thing.
How do you reconcile God's existence with undeserved suffering? So we didn't need Stephen Fry, thank you very much, to remind us of this problem.
Yes, we did. We need everybody to remind us as much as possible about the problem of suffering, because it is the most serious issue that faces the world. It should be on all of our minds. It should be on God's mind, if he has the power to stop it, and it should be on all of the minds of everybody who claims that they have the answer to it. This is not something that should be taken lightly, or not something that we should say, oh, we have some writing on that already. Yeah, this has already been mentioned, so let's keep it on hand, but let's not get too wrapped up in it, or, let's not act like it's a big deal if some other guy comes and says, oh, look at all of this other suffering. No, it should be a big deal.
Secondly, look at someone like Thomas Aquinas. Thomas formulates the objection very pithily. He says, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be destroyed. If there was infinite heat, wouldn't it eliminate all cold? So we call God infinitely good. So wouldn't that eliminate any evil?
This is a perfect example of something sounding really cool when a philosopher says it, because the language it uses is consistent. The argument is consistent just in the language, but it's obviously not true when you apply it to the real world. An infinite amount of heat doesn't mean there can't be any cold anywhere. Not to mention that the definition of good and evil as mathematical opposites, as essentially opposite ends of a single spectrum, I think is an incredibly naive and simplistic way of thinking about it. Just because we like good and we dislike evil, we think good is great, it's something to be desired, and evil isn't, that doesn't mean they're actually literally opposites. Any more than heat and cold are actually opposites. They're not. Heat is a large amount of kinetic energy per molecule, and cold is not as much kinetic energy per molecule. They're not opposites. One is just a lack of the other. It's not the negation of another. Same thing with good and evil. Sure, Thomas Aquinas' arguments sound really cool if you're just thinking about them as philosophical puzzles, but they break down so obviously if you try and apply them to the real world.
But there is evil, therefore there's no God. That's a darn good argument, and Thomas formulates that as an objection to God's existence. You get all the power of Fry's argument without the histrionics. Again, my point is, we know about this objection. We've wrestled with it. Here's the other thing. All of it, from Paul and Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, all of it is rooted finally in the single greatest rant against God's injustice ever recorded. And it's not in an essay by an atheist, old or new. It's rather found in the pages of the Bible. I'm talking, of course, about the book of Job. So we know the outline of the story. Well, Job, in one fell swoop, has to endure every type of suffering. So in one moment, he's stripped of his health, of his wealth, of his livelihood, of his family.
Yeah, isn't that the one where God slaughters a wife and children because of a bet that he wanted to win against the devil?
It's all taken away. And we know, furthermore, that Job is an innocent man. And so there he sits in agony from the suffering, but also in a kind of theological agony. I mean, how could God have possibly allowed this to happen? And Job delivers himself, in the course of that book, of rants equal to those of Stephen Fry, calling out God. We know that friends of Job arrive and they offer explanations of his suffering, and they're pretty pathetic. They're theologians at their worst, if you want. So Job eventually dismisses them, and then in one of the most dramatic scenes in the Bible, he calls God into the dock. You know I'm innocent. Why am I suffering this way? And what ensues is chapters 38 and following is the longest speech of God anywhere in the Bible, and one of the most dramatic speeches of God. What does he say to Job out of the desert whirlwind? He says, Job, where were you when I made the heavens and the earth? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world?
It's not how I would start off a speech designed to try and justify what I've done to somebody, but okay.
Where were you when I told the sea where to stop? Where were you when I stored up the wind and the hail? He takes Job on a tour of the cosmos, revealing to him all of the mysteries and anomalies, including, by the way, a little introduction to two creatures, one called Behemoth, one called Leviathan, probably a crocodile and a whale.
Really? Are you... Was it really probably a crocodile and a whale, or was it just, something the writer made up? Do they have crocodiles in the Middle East?
Creatures that Job probably has never thought of. And God says, I made them. How beautiful, how strong, how impressive they are. I made them just as I made you. In other words, they're part of my creation too. Now, what's the point? The point is, God is not so much answering the problem, is he's situating the problem within ever wider frameworks of meaning. God is the Lord of all of space and all of time. God has providential care for all of space and all of time. Whatever we're experiencing is in the context of this infinitely wider and more complex situation. Here's a comparison now with Job in mind. Take Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. How many pages? 2,000 pages, whatever it is. Imagine how one page of that book is ripped out and cast to the winds. Let's say it floats on the winds for months. It becomes further tattered. Only bits of it remain here and there. Someone now who's never read Tolkien stumbles upon this fragment of one page and reads maybe one paragraph of this great sprawling novel. Now, maybe he picked up, just a piece of bland narrative. Maybe it's a little happy incident. Or maybe he picks up Frodo and Sam in Mordor at the depth of their suffering. And he reads this one paragraph. And he goes, boy, that was a terrible story. Whoever wrote that must be some kind of monster. I mean,
yeah, now imagine that the author of the story knows that that person picked up that page, has the ability to explain to that person the context, and yet doesn't.
To have written that thing. That little fragment belongs in a page, which belongs in a chapter, which belongs in a sprawling 2,000-page novel. We who've read the story know that that terrible suffering of Frodo and Sam is ingredient in, ultimately, this comedy, ultimately in this great, joyful, and life-affirming story. Here's the point, and I'd say this is a first response to Stephen Fry. What do we see of God's providence? We see one tiny swath of
And whose fault is that?
space and time. One little fragment, one sliver of space and time. Do we see good things? Yeah. Do we see terrible suffering? Yeah, both of them. This makes no sense. There's no justification. There's no meaning in any of it. You see how arrogant that is? How absolutely unwarranted that is?
Bishop Barron wants us to believe that drawing conclusions based on all of the available evidence that we have to us is arrogant. To say, Bishop Barron would like to say, that if we see something that we don't understand, if we see someone on the street being mugged, if we see somebody being raped, if we read in the paper about a town of innocent people that was bombed, we shouldn't say, oh, based on everything that I know, that's a terrible act, and I should try to stop it. No. No, we should say, well, do I really know for sure? Do I know everything that God knows? If not, well, I guess I should just assume it's okay then. I start with the assumption, Bishop Barron would like me to say, that everything that happens is good. That I'm just whenever I see something in the world that contradicts the claim that God is just and good, I should just assume that I am too stupid or ignorant to understand why it's actually a good thing. And do you see the other big problem with this implication? That if we all were to believe this, and if we all decided collectively that all of the evil in the world that happens, it's actually for a greater good. It's all part of God's great and mysterious plan. Well then, I guess we shouldn't try and stop any of this evil. Because we know that there's a good reason for it, right? We know that ultimately God wouldn't have put this evil in his plan if it weren't for the best for all of us. So, certainly don't want to stop any evil. God has foreseen all of this, right? He knows exactly what will happen. So anything that happens that causes suffering, by definition, must be justified in this great plan. This appeal that Bishop Barron is making is an appeal against the very fundamentals of our basic rationality and self-interest. That we should start with a conclusion and assume, despite all that we know, that we must be wrong if the information we see doesn't match that conclusion, is a recipe for calamity, for the collapse of everything that we consider the most valuable to us, our desire to help other people, our understanding that suffering is wrong and we should prevent it, and that if children are killed or somebody's innocent wife is killed, as God did to Job's family in the Bible, that was a bad thing, and it's better off, it would be better if that did not happen, and we should do our best to prevent anything like that from happening. This is the basis of almost all of our everyday ethics. And Bishop Barron wants us to give that up, to say, well, you know, maybe there's a reason for it. Do you know anything? Do you know everything? You can't prove God doesn't have a reason for it. Sure, everything that we know and everything that God has let us see points me to the conclusion that this is wrong. But that's my problem. That's not God. That's just my own stupidity. God must be good, so I must be wrong. What a terrible way to approach life. What terrible consequences would come from the belief that bad things that happen are actually good, and we're just too stupid to see how.
How can we possibly say, based on this little tiny experience of God's providence, that God's overall providence has no purpose or meaning? It's a bit like someone who knows no mathematics stumbling upon this hyper-complex algebraic formula and looking and saying, it's just a bunch of gibberish. That doesn't mean anything. Look at these nonsensical symbols. How arrogant, you who know nothing of mathematics, to be pronouncing on a complex algebraic formula.
No, that analogy fails because we do know the laws of ethics. They were written on our hearts, right? By God. So the correct analogy would be somebody who understands algebra coming across an algebraic inscription where somebody divides by 0, and them knowing, based on the laws of algebra that they understand, that that is not allowed, and that is an error, saying, oh, that's wrong. They can't do that. And then Bishop Barron coming and saying, oh, how arrogant of you. Are you saying that there couldn't be some hidden laws of algebra in which this is allowed? So arrogant of you to try and apply what you've learned to this and to say that it's wrong. You don't know everything. Don't use your reason. Don't tell me that it's wrong. I'm sure that there's somebody out there who understands this better than you, so it can't be an error.
The awareness of the various contexts for our experience is needed before we pronounce on meaning or lack thereof. Here's a second observation. If you believe in God, and remember the premise for Fry's question was that God really does exist. What would you say to God? If you accept that God exists, you accept that there's a life beyond this one. That this life is not the ultimate horizon of the
Not necessarily. I mean, that depends on the God. If you accept the Christian God exists, and that he is telling us the truth, and that truth has been accurately preserved in the Gospels, then yes. But it doesn't follow directly from believing in God that there's an afterlife. There are plenty of gods, religions with gods that don't have afterlives.
existence. There's a life beyond this one. Once you know that, can you say, yeah, the suffering of a child in this world, it's terrible. Of course it is. Of course it's terrible. Bone cancer in children, of course it's terrible. Of course. But, is it nothing but terrible? Is it irredeemably terrible? Is it terrible, period? Or is it perhaps ingredient in a much larger story? Is it perhaps even a route of access to a deeper and richer life?
Imagine a God, a good, loving God, who creates a universe knowing that the only route of getting the end state that he wants is going to be by giving children bone cancer, and decides to do it anyway. That's okay that kids get bone cancer. That's okay that, this village of people is slaughtered. That's okay. Nuclear weapons, the Holocaust, mass starvation, all that. No, that's okay. Because they're all ingredients in this really great thing I'm cooking up for later. And by creating the universe, this God has stated unequivocally that it's better that all of this suffering occurs and that I get, the end deal that I want. That some people maybe will be happy in the end. That's better. The ends justify the means.
The day on which Jesus was betrayed, denied, abandoned, scourged, unjustly condemned, led to his crucifixion, and left to die on a terrible instrument of torture, we Christians call Good Friday. How in the world would you call that day good? Because that day is not the final day. That's not the ultimate word. But beyond that, there lies resurrection. To believe in God is to believe in that possibility. And that provides another framework for this question. So I guess I would say, finally, to understand why Christians call that day Good Friday is the ultimate answer to Job and the ultimate answer to Stephen Fry.
You'll notice that Bishop Barron never actually gave an explanation for suffering. He said, "Oh, there's an explanation out there, don't worry. We just don't know it, can't understand it, and God hasn't shown it to us." If you want to do that, nobody can stop you. I just hope you understand the cost that comes with a willingness to approach an issue with your conclusion already assumed, and being willing to disregard any evidence you see, the obvious evidence we have that something like the Holocaust was wrong, and just sweep all of that aside if need be, if you can't find any reason for why it wouldn't be wrong. Just say, oh, well, I'm sure there's a reason. Look, I mean, the universe is big. God is powerful. He knows a lot of stuff. I'm sure he's got things under control. I hope Bishop Barron understands the cost of thinking like that.